I guess we'll go ahead and get started. It's about time. So let's pick up where we left off last time in 2 Corinthians. I'll read that section that we've been considering, and then we'll consider a little bit more of it. But I'll read 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 16 through 29. So 2 Corinthians chapter 11, 16 through 29. And this is a letter of Paul to the church at Corinth. He says, I repeat, let no one think me foolish, but even if you do, accept me as a fool, so that I too may boast a little. What I'm saying with this boastful confidence, I say not as the Lord would, but as a fool. Since many boast according to the flesh, I too will boast. For you gladly bear with fools, being wise yourselves. For you bear it when someone makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or strikes you in the face. To my shame, I must say, we were too weak for that. But whatever anyone else dares to boast of, and I'm speaking as a fool, I also dare to boast of that. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I am a better one, and I'm talking like a madman, with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from the Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless nights, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is made to fall, and I am not indignant? All right, let's pray, and we'll consider this section as we go. Father, again, as we come to you in fellowship, we just thank you so much for your written word. We thank you for your word through Paul that teaches us the characteristics of a true apostle, a true teacher, a true man of God, and how we can identify that against those that teach lies and falsehoods and the false apostles. We thank you that you have made this, although it's a personal letter from Paul to the church at Corinth, it is certainly something that we can profit by and learn from. And I pray that as we consider it today, that it will do just that. It will open our eyes to the things Paul went through, the things that a true apostle went through, and how we can know the difference, dear Lord. In this world today, it's difficult, but your word makes that very clear. Be with me as I speak, that it be clearly, and I won't deviate from any truth. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen. So Paul's life, as we know, he had many accomplishments. He was a very accomplished man. Even before his conversion on the Damascus Road, he was advancing ahead of his peers in the Jewish tradition and religion. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was taught at the feet of Gamaliel, which was the ultimate teacher at that time. He was ultimately zealous for the Lord to the point of killing Christians. And then after his conversion, he was just as accomplished, only this time for the Lord. What he thought he was doing for the Lord before his conversion, now he truly was doing for the Lord. And he, planted many churches. He made many converts through his preaching. He saw just many miraculous things happen. People were burning their books and things like that were against the Lord. But he also, besides his great accomplishment, went through great suffering. I think we have seen that as we've been going through the book of 2 Corinthians. He he mentions it really 4 times, and this is the 4th time he mentions in it, but great physical suffering, as he outlines here in the section we'll consider today, but also significant mental suffering. Remember when he did come back to the church at Corinth, when the false teachers had come, and he had that painful visit. Remember, he got so depressed that he had an opportunity to preach at Troas, but he couldn't do it because of his because he was so worried and anxious of the church at Corinth. So he had this mental anxiety that stuck with him as well, and that was also from the Lord. And he tells us that in the last 2 verses we'll consider today, in 28 and 29. So Paul knew that would be his lot in life. You know, he and all the apostles knew beforehand that suffering would be part of his life, and they knew that by direct and uncompromising preaching of the gospel, that they would experience persecution, they would experience affliction, they were experiencing suffering. And we learned that last time in Matthew 10, when Jesus was commissioning the 12, the disciples. He told them what it was going to be like. He told them he was putting them out as sheep among wolves, that it was going to be a hostile environment. In verse 17, he said, "You're going to deliver you over to the courts. They're going to flog you in the synagogues. They're going to drag you before governors and kings. And the purpose of it is so as you can be my witness to the Gentiles." That was the purpose of that. And then in verse 21, he also tells them it's going to be, the affliction and the persecution is going to be even among your own family. That's going to be, you're going to be persecuted there also. And then he kind of sums it up at the end of chapter 10 in Matthew that he says a disciple is not above his teacher. You know, if they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you. If you represent me in my teaching, they're going to do the same thing to you they did to me. And so the disciples knew that ahead of time. And then in John 15, at a different time, Jesus kind of relates that again to the disciples, kind of reiterates it, saying the same thing, that a disciple is not above his teacher, that if they persecuted me, they'll persecute you. And then in chapter 16, verse 1, he says, "I tell you this beforehand, so you may not fall away." So he's telling them that so they know what to expect. They know what to expect. It would be just like, remember when Jesus and Peter were walking on the road, and Jesus told Peter that Satan's asked that he could have you for a while, he could sift you, and you know, Peter, his response should have been, "You told him no, didn't you?" But you know, he didn't. He said he's going to sift you, but you know, I will pray for you, and after you have come back, you will, you know, feed my sheep. So he's telling them beforehand he's going to have trials and afflictions, but he also knows the ultimate outcome. And that's the way the disciples and all the apostles understood. That was their life. And then Paul, specifically in Acts 9, remember, was told directly by Ananias from Jesus that I'm going to show him how much he has to suffer for my name. So they knew that anyone trying to live a godly life, preaching the truth, would be persecuted. And Paul says that in 2 Timothy. He goes, any of us who want to live a godly life will be persecuted. But they also rejoiced in that persecution, as the apostles did in Acts 5 when they were beaten for the Lord. They rejoiced that they could suffer dishonor. So that's the same idea that the apostles and all that are true to God understand, that there will be persecution and affliction. So Paul teaches us this is a life of an apostle in the context of his letter here to the Corinthians, where again he is defending himself, but in reality what he's doing, he's demonstrating to the Corinthians the difference between these false apostles over here and the true apostles, of which I am one. So we understand that as you read this also, and I kind of was noticing that, especially chapters 10 through 12 here, when Paul is speaking, many times he uses we, and sometimes he uses I. And I think as we're reading that, it really kind of brings out some things there. When he uses we a lot, a lot of commentators think that's kind of the editorial we. It's more of a humble way of saying it's not just me, but we do this, we do that. But if you look really closely at it, a lot of the times he uses we is when he's speaking to the way this is how we act. Like we don't go beyond boasting something we didn't do. We don't boast about the labor of others, he says in chapter 10. The false apostles do. And he uses we a lot of times in that. But then when he gets to this section that I just read, he uses I a lot. He uses I because he's going to now boast of his accomplishments. And he's not going to do it like he said up there. He goes, the Lord didn't do this. I didn't learn this from the Lord, but I'm going to boast about it. And it's interesting how he does that because as he boasts, he doesn't really become prideful. He retains his humility, which we understand is one of the marks of a true apostle. The idea that nothing he has he deserves, okay, except the bad things. But anything that he's accomplished and the grace and mercy came from God, he didn't deserve it. And anything he accomplishes after he is saved by the Lord, he didn't do. He does that in the power of the Lord. So it's very interesting how he does that. And so he, in essence, then kind of distinguishes himself and makes a kind of a line in the sand about what's different from him than the false apostles who you guys at Corinth have been kind of following. So he makes it understood that, and he starts that in verse 22. Let's just kind of go there again. He's speaking how in verse 21 he says, I'm going to boast. He goes, but, it's foolishness to do that. Number one, boasting is foolish. But I'm going to do it. The false apostles do it. They boast of their commendations and who they are and the accomplishments they've had. I'm going to boast also. And it's going to be kind of a completely different boasting. I think it's foolish that we're doing this because, I spent 2 years with you guys there, and you should know my life by now and everything about me. And still, I need to do this for you to understand the difference between us and not be seduced into false doctrine and false teaching. So now he's comparing himself in verse 22, and he says, in verse 22, he just says that we're on the same level with respect to our heritage. Okay, they're Hebrews, Israelites, offspring of Abraham. The false teachers claim to be, they were Jews, and so on that level, they were the same because the apostles needed to be Jewish. That's where the 12 apostles came from. So he's saying on that level we're the same, but then in verse 23 he's saying I'm far better, far more. And the way he starts, it says, are they servants of Christ? Again, it must be really hard for him to say that because he knows they're not servants of Christ. They're false teachers, false apostles. They're servants of their father, the devil. They're disguised as apostles of Christ. So when he says that, are they servants of Christ, he's saying it just for the sake of argument. Okay, he doesn't really think they're servants of Christ. Okay, he says I'm a better one. That's why he says I'm talking like a madman or talking as insane because he understands they really are not servants of Christ. But for the sake of arguments, are they servants of Christ? I'm a better one. And then he begins to list his accomplishments as a servant of Christ. He lists these sufferings and afflictions. And as I said earlier, this isn't the first time we've heard it in this letter. In chapter 1, verses 4 through 10, he has another list of afflictions and sufferings. Chapter 4, 7 through 10, chapter 6, 4 through 10, he lists several afflictions and sufferings he's been through. And none of these lists are certainly comprehensive, okay? But even in the book of Acts, it lists many of the sufferings and the beatings and the imprisonments and that he went through. And again, we have to understand that is the list of them aren't going to be perfect because each one just mentions kind of what's necessary to make the point. Okay, Luke and Acts will mention things necessary to make the point, And certainly it's not going to be a comprehensive list in any of them. But this is Paul's life. This is what he's experienced. And so it would behoove us to go through it somewhat slowly, but we need to touch on some of these as well. So let's just kind of begin in verse 23 when he says, far greater labors. Okay, that word labors, greater labors. I think that over here in our scriptural reference, he uses that word kapos, and that means certainly working to the point of exhaustion. It's not just working, but laboring, working to the point of exhaustion. You know, when we talk in medical terms, when your breathing is labored, it means you're to the point of exhaustion. You're breathing so much you can't get the air in. You're exhausted with it. But he used that same word several times, and I think I listed a few there in 1 Corinthians 15:58. Just knowing that in the Lord your labor, anything you work to exhaustion, is not in vain. In Luke 5:5, it's mentioned when Peter, Simon, said, "Master, we toiled all night." That means he fished all night to the point of exhaustion. We took nothing. But by your word I'll let down my nets, and you know what happened after that. In John 4:6, the same word is used, or a form of that word is used when it said Jesus was wearied from his journey. Same word. He was wearied to the point of exhaustion. That's the idea there. And in 1 Corinthians 15:10, I love that verse, and I probably quote it every time we have a Bible study, but it says, "By the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them." Again, I labored harder than any of them, but it was not I, but the grace of God in me that did that. And the reason Paul labored so much is because he supported himself. He tells us this in Corinthians. He tells us this in Acts. He tells us this in Thessalonians. He didn't charge money for preaching the gospel. He explains that to us in his first letter to the Corinthians, that he didn't want that to be a stumbling block to the gospel. So he did not charge money, meaning that he had to support himself. And he tells us that in Acts 20:34 and 35. He says, "You yourselves know," he's speaking to the Ephesian elders, I think, and he says, "You yourselves know that these hands," talking about his hands, "ministered to my necessities and to those who were with me." So not only did he have to support himself by his work, but he supported those that traveled with him also. And then verse 35, "In all things I have shown you that by working hard in this way, you must help the weak and remember the words of Jesus, how he himself says, more blessed to give than to receive." And in 1 Thessalonians 2:9, he says, "For you remember, brothers, our labor and toil. We worked night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you while we proclaim to you the gospel of God." So Paul would preach during the day and work at night, or vice versa. He'd work during the day and preach at night. Anyway, he worked to the point of exhaustion to support himself. So he said far greater labors, because the false teachers, remember, they charged for what they did. They wanted a life of ease, a life of relative ease, and they did not work to support themselves, but wanted to be paid for what they did. So many labors, they worked to support himself, and then imprisonments, far more imprisonments. Well, really only one imprisonment had taken place at the time he wrote this letter, 2 Corinthians. That was the one described in Acts 16 in Philippi, as you recall. But we know there was others that came afterwards. He was when he went to Jerusalem, and towards the end of the book of Acts in 22, and the mob got after him, so the Romans threw him in prison to save his life. And then they didn't know what to do with him, so they sent him to Caesarea. Finally, he appealed to Caesar, and then he was sent to Rome. And that prison was a little different. He was afforded some freedom and stuff, but those are the ones that we know of. But tradition tells us towards the end of the first century, I said there in Clement about AD 96, about the time John wrote Revelation, So it would have been fairly soon after all this taken place, so fairly accurate. He said that Paul was imprisoned 7 times during his life. So many imprisonments, far more imprisonments certainly than the false teachers, with countless beatings, countless beatings, often near death. Many beatings, and we'll go. He'll demonstrate a couple of them, and just when he's talking about the 40 lashes less one. But Paul's countless beatings, often near death. Paul was always facing death. Okay, I mean, any day could have been his last, and that would have been fine with him because he says to live is Christ, to die is gain. But he faced death every day. It could have been at the last month. He didn't know when the Lord would take him home with him, right? So he faced it every day, and it was demonstrated. I mean, the Jews plotted to kill him. The Gentiles wanted to kill him. Kind of everybody wanted to kill him. And he took many countless beatings because of that, which he then outlines in the next verse, or he outlines in verses 24 and 25, where he says, 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes less one. 40 lashes less one. So these beatings kind of were in every place. The idea of 40 lashes less one really comes from Old Testament law. Okay, the Jews didn't have penitentiaries. They didn't have prisons. Okay. If the offense was severe enough, the justice was served. They were stoned. They were killed. Okay, justice was swift. Okay, and pretty obvious. Definitely had an effect on those around him. But if it was a lesser offense, then in Deuteronomy 25, it tells us how that was handled. And I'll read that to you. It says, if there is a dispute between men, and they come into court, and the judges decide between them, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty, then if the guilty man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall cause him to lie down and be beaten in the presence with a number of stripes in proportion to the offense. Okay, so it may be significantly less than 40. Okay, 40 stripes may be given, but not more, lest, if one should go on to beat him with more stripes than these, your brother be degraded in your sight. So these were things that were given to an offense that didn't deserve death, and he could give anywhere up to 40 stripes, but more would degrade him. And I guess it's the idea that it's like our children. There's some honor in taking your lumps, taking your beating, making restitution, and kind of getting back to life. So when we use that on our children as well, that's kind of what we're trying to teach them. There's some honor in doing that. You did something wrong, you make restitution, you go back. But you can never give more than 40. And the way this was carried out is in the synagogue. Okay, so it was like church discipline. Okay, to the max. Okay. In the synagogue, and it tells that the man that's going to get the 40 stripes would be bare from the waist up. He would be kind of bent over. The one that's delivering the blows, the master of the synagogue or whatever, would stand on a big stone behind him, and he had to deliver one third of the lashes to the front of the body, to the chest, and 2/3 to the back and shoulders. And if the man died while he was doing that, well, the guy wasn't held responsible or anything for it. He could get off, It wasn't his fault the guy died, okay? So the idea was that once it would also always leave marks. I mean, Paul said in Galatians 17, I wear on my body the marks of Jesus, and that's from his many lashes. And so he states there that he 5 times at the Jews, okay, and so that was justice in the Jewish system, And just as a side note, penitentiary, you know where that came from? It came from the Quakers, and because they felt that if a man did something wrong, that if he went somewhere and just sat around long enough, he'd become penitent about it. He would, and we know that doesn't work, probably, right? It doesn't work for sure. So and that kind of came, the modern prison system came when Ben Franklin, shortly after that. So anyway, penitentiaries don't work. And Paul was beaten many times. That was, and it's interesting how they beat, they beat the people like the prophets. They would do that to the prophets as well. They beat them, they'd murder them, when in fact they were beating the wrong people, I guess we'll have to say. 3 times he was beaten with rods, and that would be delivered by the Gentiles or the Romans typically. Excuse me. And it would be at a different time. It's recorded, the only time that's recorded is in Acts 16 at Philippi when he was in jail and he was beaten by the jailer before they were done. But he said 3 times that happened. Then he said once he was stoned. Once he was stoned. We remember that story in Acts 14 at Lystra. He was stoned and supposed he was dead. Remember, he was left for dead. But he wasn't dead, right? Okay, but some people point back to that stoning and say that you know, we're going to speak about Paul's revelations and his visit to heaven coming up in chapter 12. Some people point back to that stoning and said that Paul really died there and he was resurrected, but that's just not the case, because the way it's worded also in Acts 14, it says supposing they were dead, and supposing usually means that you kind of surmise something that's not true. In any resurrection that's been demonstrated in the New Testament, there's no doubt. It's pretty obvious that he was resurrected. So Paul was beaten a lot to the point of death, but didn't die in that. So he was stoned that time. And then he was shipwrecked. How many times? He said, 3 times I was shipwrecked. Okay, at the writing of this, 3 times he'd been shipwrecked. We know that Paul traveled many times, and really the Acts outlines about 9 different trips that he makes. 3 of them obviously were, 9 of them happened before he wrote this. 9 journeys on a trip. 3 of them ended up in shipwrecks. So that was the way you traveled back then. 1/3 of the time, if you got on a ship, it was going to wreck. And so Paul experienced that. And then, according to him, he he had a day and a night that he was adrift at sea in one of those shipwrecks. So Paul's shipwrecks. Let's see, shipwrecks were part of his life because of his frequent journeys. Verse 26, frequent journeys. And then he lists those as well. Journeying, and we have to understand journeying and moving around was what Paul was commissioned to do by the Lord, to take the word to the Gentiles. So his journeys were many, and travel at that time wasn't quite like travel it is now, as you can well imagine. It was physically demanding and dangerous. Roads were few. Wasn't any highway patrolmen out there, patrolling the roads to protect you. There were robbers and things. So he says on frequent journeys, he had 3 main missionary journeys, but among those missionary journeys, he's traveling all the time. And so then he says that, and that obviously put an element of danger in him, danger from rivers. Obviously, crossing rivers at that time was a little different than it is now. Bridges were few and flooding was frequent. So, nowadays you don't even have to take your foot off the cruise control and you just kind of go over this big wide river. But you can imagine how long it would take to do that on foot. Robbers, like I said, they were full of, they were easy prey. People that were traveling would be easy prey for robbers at that time, and no one was patrolling the highways to protect you or anything. And he says, danger from my own people. That is to say, that's an understatement. I guess we'll have to say that, because the Jews were always plotting to kill him. Every city he went into, remember what he'd do? He'd preach in the synagogue, and they some would believe and follow him, but after a while, the rest became hostile, and they would plot to kill him. And that happened in Acts 9, Acts 13, Acts 14, 17, 18, 20, 21. It happened pretty much everywhere he went. The Jews plotted to kill him. And then not only the Jews, but less frequently the Gentiles did the same thing. And that, as we talked about in Philippi, that happened when he drove the demon out of that little slave girl and took away their ability to make money. The townspeople of Philippi got kind of mad at him, started a riot. He got thrown in prison. It also happened at Ephesus when those that made the things of Artemis, their god, those that would make the little idols of God, realized Paul was having an effect on the town, so people weren't buying their idols of Artemis anymore, and so they started a riot again for him also. So the Gentiles did it as well, but he was in danger really just because he's preaching light in the darkness. So wherever he went, that's how it was. And then he says in the city, he said it didn't matter if he was in the city or in the wilderness, they were out to get him. Primarily in the city, especially in Ephesus, like we talked about. And then we went to Jerusalem. The mobs came after it. Philippi, Lystra, he was stoned. Iconium, Berea, Thessalonica, they all, he was in danger everywhere he wanted. And, you wonder why Paul didn't change his message a little bit, make it a little more seeker-friendly instead of seeker-hostile. But he didn't. He was uncompromising, as were all of the apostles, and as are those true teachers today. They will be uncompromising for the Word of God. In wilderness, certainly in the wilderness, dangers of exposure. Things weren't, obviously you weren't protected as well as you could now by staying in a hotel. But it probably tells us that Paul sometimes would take the road less traveled, or he'd travel maybe a shorter distance through the wilderness instead of staying on the road where it was danger as well from robbers, etc. And then in the sea, he talked about his shipwrecks already as well. But actually more to came after he wrote this. As you recall, when he was going to Rome, he had a shipwreck also. So Paul was in danger everywhere he went. But he understood that, and he knew that's the way it was going to be. And so he was not worried about that because he knew that the Lord would use him until the time that he was going to take him home with him. But probably the worst and the most difficult would be the dangers from false brethren. And that really hurt him the most. Those would be those brothers that claimed Christ but were really false teachers and would undermine his teaching. And that would include the false apostles there at Corinth. It would also include the Judaizers that plagued him at the Galatian church, the false brethren there. And really Paul was kind of plagued with that because everywhere he went, it seemed like after he left, there would be false teachers come in. And that wore on Paul. That wore on Paul because he had this constant anxiety and empathy for those that were under his care. He had that true pastoral sympathy and was worried for their souls. So when these false teachers would come in, he would, as he did at Corinth, he went back and visited them, had that painful visit, and then he again wrote this letter also to kind of teach him the difference between them. So he always had that worried of the souls of those that he took care of. So Paul faced all these physical dangers every day, and the suffering that he underwent was, it was prophesied that's what it was going to be. Jesus told his apostles and Paul that that's the way it's going to be. You're going to suffer for my sake. And all who preach that way will do that. So this suffering, he uses it in the context here of his mark as a true apostle of God. That is what he is saying here. And then not only was the physical suffering, but it was but the dangers, not only from the elements and from other people and things like that, but just the dangers from himself and the toils and the labors that he went through. In verse 27, he speaks of toil and hardship. Again, that toil is that same word for labor, work to the point of exhaustion. Hardship, that Greek word means hardship related to prolonged trial. So Paul's life was characterized by working to the point of exhaustion over a prolonged period of time because he supported himself. He had to supply for his own needs. And this was a long-term, that's what his life was, that he had this hardship just to eke out a living and to survive. He went through many toils and hardships. And I think we talked about that also. I think I just recopied 1 Thessalonians 2:9 down there. It says, "For you remember, brothers, our labor and toil. We worked night and day, that we might not be a burden to you." And then in 2 Thessalonians, he kind of reiterates that, "Nor did we eat anyone's bread." I mean, he supported without paying for it, so he supported himself. But with toil and labor, that's the same two words he uses right here for toil and hardship, toil and labor, that we might not be a burden to any of you. So that is the purpose of his his labor, is to support himself, not to be a burden. So as his preaching of the gospel, he will not put any kind of stumbling block in front of it that people could say he was doing it for the money, he was doing it for greed. And it says, then in many sleepless nights, and I think this refers to here, because he's speaking of toil and hardship, it's because he would preach all day, work all night, or work all night, preach all day. He'd have many sleepless nights. And as you know, Paul, just an example of that would be in Acts 20 when he preached till midnight. And in the morning they broke bread. He preached till midnight. Remember the young man you teach us fell out the third story thing and died? Okay, that was kind of judgment on him for falling asleep during a sermon. That's what happened. No, they went down there and they resurrected him because, Paul wasn't done preaching yet. And then it said he preached till morning. That's a long time. I mean, how many of us could stay here that long? Not me. But it gives you an idea of how long he preached, how hard he worked. He had to support himself. So if he's preaching all day, he's got to at some point make some money to feed himself. But sometimes he didn't, so he did go hunger and thirst on occasion. He even mentioned that earlier in chapter 11, that when he was among the Corinthians themselves, he was hungry and thirsty. He got behind. Either he wasn't able to make enough money to support himself, but even at that, he didn't tell them. He didn't ask the Corinthians for money, but he continued to preach the word without asking for that. And then in cold and exposure, obviously shelter was, as he traveled, was few. And put a couple of verses down there. But really the last one I just want to point your attention to would be Philippians 4:11 through 13. So Paul went through all these hardships, but he was content in not only the hardships, but the good times as well. He learned how to be content, and he tells us that in Philippians chapter 4. It says, "Not that I'm speaking of being need, for I have learned in whatever situation to be content." He says, "For I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound." So he knew how to survive in any of that. So in any and every circumstance, I've learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. He was content in it. And he says, "I can do all things through him that strengthens me." So he understood God would strengthen him through all those circumstances, the hunger, the need, the plenty. He understood that. And he also understood that all these trials he went through were also evidence of his salvation. And how do I know that? And because he wrote in Romans 8, which I wrote down there as well, he knew that he would never be separated from God's love. So in Romans 8:35, he says this, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation?" Nope, he's been there. "Distress?" Nope, done that too. Persecution, yep, every day I face that. Famine, yep, been there too. Nakedness, danger, every day I face that. Sword, yep, everyone's always trying to kill me. And as is written, for your sake we're being killed all day long. We're regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. He died every day. He died every day in his mind, knowing that could be his last. And he says, no, in verse 37, all these things were more than conquerors through him that loved us. So he could say with assurity, for I am sure that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation, that's a pretty comprehensive list, will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. So all these things that Paul went through assured him of his apostleship, and he was using them as evidence of his apostleship to the church at Corinth, in contrast to those false apostles who were characterized primarily by greed and pride and not the humility that he has. Let me finish up really quick, and maybe we'll go over it last time. Verse 28 and 29 are really kind of important. So I guess to understand, so apart from all these physical sufferings and the persecutions and the hunger, the work into exhaustion, apart from all those he mentioned, he says in verse 28, apart from other things. And what he's really saying is, and apart from, some of the translations say apart from external things, okay, which would be the persecutions, the beatings, everything he's been through. But apart from these things and other things that maybe I didn't mention, okay, all these external things, there's the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Okay, so Paul is saying here that apart from all these external sufferings I've been through, I have this internal anxiety and desire for all my churches. And not not for any type of, I don't know what you call it, administrative things. He wasn't saying, well, I need to do this, and this for that church to make sure, or I need to do this and that. He was anxious because he was worried about their souls and being led away by these false teachers. And that was a daily pressure on him. That was a daily pressure, daily constant pressure. And that word is translated anxiety is really care or concern. But it's a daily concern. And he expresses this concern then in verse 29 when he gives a couple rhetorical questions. He says, who is weak and I'm not weak? Meaning basically this, he's showing his sympathy, his empathy for them. He says, so which one of you maybe is weak in faith and is being drawn away by temptation or these false teachers, and I'm not alongside you with that? I'm not weak with you. I don't empathize for you. I don't care for you. It's in the sermon notes, 1 Corinthians 12:26. He reiterates, if one member suffers, all suffer together, right? And if one member is honored, we all rejoice together. That's what we are as the body of Christ. And he was demonstrating that for his churches. In 1 Thessalonians, he says, we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, that would be the weak, those that could be drawn away, help the weak, be patient with them all. And in Romans 14, he says, as for the one who is weak in faith, you welcome him. Romans 15:1, we who are strong have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. So Paul's demonstrating that. He has this empathy, this desire that if one of his little ones is being led astray, weak in faith, being demonstrated, he was right there with them. He felt their weakness, and he wanted to help them. False teachers have no such desire for that. They just want to. It's all about themselves. And then it says, he finishes up with the second rhetorical question: who is made to fall, or who is led into sin? I think some of the translations say, and I'm not indignant. or I'm not burning, I think is what the King James says, and that's what that word means, indignant. I'm not set on fire is what it literally means. So what he's saying here, so if one of my little ones who is led into sin, and I'm not burning with, righteous indignation that's happening, he goes, that's what I am. I have this constant anxiety. That's who I am for those. So, and he would say it'd be better that what he looks at it as the way Jesus said when he said it'd be better if one of these, whoever causes one of these little ones to be led in sin, it'd be better for him to have a great millstone fashioned around him and drowned in the depth of the sea. That's the way Paul had that righteous indignation, that holy anger for those that would make the weak stumble. So he was always empathic for them. So Paul just kind of shows us his heart in this. He's showing the Corinthians his heart. He's saying, I'm not getting anything physical out of this. I'm just being beaten up because this is what God told me would happen. So these are my credentials as being the true apostle of Christ. This is what it is. It's not any written letter or anything like that. It's my heart that burns when something bad happens to you. So that's kind of where Paul is leading this, and we'll kind of take it up there next time and begin to talk about his thorn in the flesh, who I'm sure everyone here can tell me what that thorn is, right? We all have an idea what it is, and we'll talk about it. I've got it. So I'll tell you next time, okay? All right, Father, thank you so much again for this time that we can use in your word. We thank you for demonstrating your righteousness in Paul. We thank you for the letters that you have written through him that show us who you are and really what it means to be to teach truth in a dark world, dear Lord. Just give us the eyes to see and the heart to desire you just in truth and word, dear Lord. Thank you again for this time. In your Son's name, amen.